Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on, everybody? Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on? My father was a freedom fighter and I'm his freedom son. I'm gonna stay right here.
Earlier, this is also the beginning of the development of the COFO relationship. But the Freedom Riders played a central role in the development of what was identified as the McComb Project. Because a number of the Freedom Riders, when they got out of Parchman, they came to McComb. Because SNCC had adopted McComb as their first project. It's sort of the SNCC Coordinating Committee. And all of you read this, or some of you read this, that they had decided that McComb would be the place where they would start the project. And you know the story of Bob Moses getting to McComb, how he got there, how he came to Mississippi. And the Bob Moses connection was really through the NAACP, right? Amzie Moore, C.C. Bryant, because initially when Bob Moses came to Mississippi to start the voter registration drive, after he had previously been in Mississippi the year before, he went to Amzie Moore first in Baldwin County, in Cleveland. And Amzie Moore said, well, we don't quite have the apparatus. And that was sort of the essence of it. We aren't quite ready to deal with the voter registration drive in the Delta here in Baldwin County, but we're going to send you to C.C. Bryant. And yesterday we mentioned C.C. Bryant in the context of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and the fact that he was president of the local chapter of the NAACP in McComb and in Pike County. So Bob Moses went to McComb. C.C. Bryant, another member of that Medgar Evers NAACP network. And I think this networking piece is really important when you think about the movement, because it helps to connect the dots for the student. The name Ruby Hurley came up in Dr. Williams' talk. And the central role that Ruby Hurley played in that process, and Aaron Henry. I mean, this network of NAACP people who had laid the foundation. Now, so in McComb you get C.C. Bryant, and you get this confluence of people coming to McComb. You get this confluence of organizations. You get the Freedom Rider, Dave Dennis. You know, you get the Freedom Riders coming out of Parchman. You get Marion Barry Jr., right? You get Chuck McDougall, right, who becomes the second chairman of SNCC, right, in McComb. You get Reggie Robertson, right? You get Charles Melvin Sherrod Jr., right, who is in McComb. And you know the Sherrod story. Sherrod was in McComb, and then he went to Albany, Georgia. So think about this cast of characters, these untested organizers who had been Freedom Riders, and of course Bob Moses had not been a Freedom Rider. Bob Moses had not even been at the SNCC meeting in Atlanta when they said, we're going to coordinate this effort in McComb. But Bob Moses went there to start the voter registration project, and he was invited and participated with C.C. Bryant. Now think about the presence of the cast of characters, and some of you should really see Freedom Song. If you have not seen the movie Freedom Song, it's worth it, because, you know, it sort of tells the McComb story, you know, in once you get some sense of McComb, you will be able to detect, you know, the cast of characters of that. But then in McComb you get the beginning of this movement forward. Hollis Watkins, who just left here, was a local person. Curtis Mohammed was a local person. Curtis Hayes, you know, Jackie Bird Martin, who's going to be here at 2:30, was a local person. She was a student at Burgland High School. But think about teaching McComb. Think about teaching the subject, because before you got here, most of you probably had heard of McComb, Illinois, but you had not heard of McComb, Mississippi. So, but McComb, Mississippi is really important in this Mississippi civil rights narrative. It becomes central, as Professor Williams just pointed out, that they started the demonstrations in a very serious way in Jackson in 1962. That the Tougaloo Nine tried to integrate the library March 27, 1961. Freedom Riders came in May of 1961. But what happens in McComb is that you had a sustained movement, above the ground movement, as I like to point out, that you had not had before in Mississippi. So, but now understand the connections between the SNCC people, the core people, through Dave Dennis, actually Tom Gaither, coming to Mississippi and having that impact. So I want you to think about, how do you teach this movement? Because you have Bob Moses coming from this other place, this other town, New York. And you have these Mississippi people already here. And you have Marion Barry, who comes from Memphis, Tennessee, via Nashville, where he had been a graduate student at Fisk, right? And you have Chuck McDew coming from Ohio. And you have the invitation from C.C. Bryant, because Bob Moses is going to do this voter registration drive in McComb. So in one sense, you have these sort of national personalities, although, you know, they were, you know, young and unknown at the time, but they came from other places. They were not indigenous Mississippians. They were not people from McComb. So how do you tell that story? I mean, how do you talk to your students about doing a paper or a presentation on this gathering of people? Because if you Google Reggie Robertson, or you Google, you know, any of these people, you could probably come up with a fairly good term paper. But so this confluence of people in McComb, and then when you read the books you were asked to read, the emphasis was on Bob Moses and the SNCC people coming to McComb. The emphasis was really not on C.C. Bryant. The emphasis was not on the unknown secretary of the NAACP in McComb. But you couldn't have had the McComb Project without the unknown secretary of the NAACP in McComb. And then, if you are not a history professor or a sociology professor or a political science professor, if you teach literature someplace or mass communications, how do you tell the story? What do you do? What do you do? Do you ask your students to write a play about McComb after you read the material? So what does SNCC do? Without McComb, we wouldn't have had the Free Southern Theater, right? Anybody heard of the Free Southern Theater? Okay. The Free Southern Theater developed by SNCC, but the beginning of it really was McComb. So, since you haven't heard about it, all the people who teach literature, English, let's think about the Free Southern theater as a way to explain the McComb story, as a way to identify the people in McComb, to get at how you can make McComb come alive, if you are a historian or political scientist or a sociologist or what have you. Because when you go to Albany, right, you get the freedom singers, don't you? So you get the music in Albany. You get Cordell and you get Bernice, right? You get Bertha. You get all those people. And when you think about Albany, you think about the music. And how the music reinforced what was going on in Albany. Of course, you get the Freedom Riders, you get Charles Sherrod, you get all those people. But think about the basis. Remember, Charles Sherrod comes out of Mississippi, out of McComb, going over to Albany. But you get the Free Southern Theater. So just think about this as a possibility in terms of, in addition to talking about what was going on actively there, is that out of this, of course, out of McComb, tell the truth, then you get Hollis Watkins too. And Hollis can't sing, but it's not like Hollis is the SNCC Freedom Singers. This is just Hollis Watkins singing. And later on you get Willie Peacock, who was in Greenwood with Sam Block. Willie Peacock could sing, but it's not like the Freedom Singers, the SNCC Freedom Singers. Sam Block could sing, and Willie Peacock. So you had an unusual combination in Greenwood of Sam Block and Willie Peacock, and both could sing. Unlike a gathering of the Hayman Institute, where nobody can sing, So at least one of us should have been able to sing. But out of McComb, you get this great confluence of people who began to impact what is going on in that place. Yeah, Jeff, go right ahead.
Let me ask you about that. So then you have these people that come in and they meet the local people. And as I was reading the document that Vincent Harding gave to the people at Oxford, Ohio, he told the people go down not to talk too much, to listen to the local people. And so how did that confluence work in McComb, or for example, when you met Frank Smith up in Holly Springs, what was the relationship between these outside agitators and the local people? Obviously the confluence worked well. I mean, I really think it's important for y'all to see Freedom Song, okay? But the confluence worked well for a while. Because I think the thing that, as we talk about the local narrative, the local people, it is important for us to not lose sight of the relationship that initially developed and what was the contract. The contract between SNCC, the contract between, you read this, that the SNCC leadership cadre had decided, okay, what we're going to have, we'll have essentially two schools of thought within SNCC. We'll have these two branches, right? One will deal with direct action that Professor Williams just really talked about, where Meg Evans was moving more toward direct action. And then one will do voter registration, voter education. But now C.C. Bryant invited Bob Moses to come to McComb, as I repeat myself the third time, to do voter registration. So it's important to remember that. Because as this thing plays out, the idea of direct action was not something that C.C. Bryant had bargained for, right? Because they wanted a different kind of movement in McComb. So clearly, they did an excellent job in McComb of identifying with the local people initially. I mean, Hollis Watkins tells the story that when he got to McComb after he had come from California and had graduated from high school and had gone to California to visit and had really thought about finding a job out there, he came back and got involved in the
McComb Project, where people were saying that Martin Luther King's brother or somebody was in town. But they were looking for a leader. They were looking for somebody like Martin Luther King. They were looking for a dynamic person like King. Then, of course, they discovered Bob Moses. And when Bob Moses was introduced as the person who was going to provide leadership, they were, quite frankly, they were disappointed. Because Bob Moses is anything but King, right? He's soft-spoken, he's self-effacing, he's mild-mannered, he's thoughtful, he's quiet, he is all of these things. But he's not the kind of leader they thought that they would probably see. So Moses, in one sense, physically was a disappointment. You know, because he was not this dynamic. I can't imagine Bob Moses giving a presentation like Professor Lee. I can't imagine. I can't imagine that. And if you know Bob Moses, you can't imagine that either. You know, Bob Moses was scheduled 3 Mondays ago sort of to talk about Freedom Summer. And he was, you know, described as, you know, one of the architects or the chief architect of Freedom Summer. He was here in Jackson at the Archives and History, the old Capitol Museum. Bob Moses got up and talked for 45 minutes. Talked about every damn thing but Freedom Summer. You know? So, I mean, this is just, this is the way he rolls, you know, but that's Bob Moses. But, so they were disappointed in one sense that Bob Moses was not this person that they were looking for. They were looking for a second coming of Martin Luther King. And he was not that. So as they organized and did voter registration and people discovered that they were there, then there were requests and other outlining areas for people to come and start voter registration drives. And the point that's important here is that as they interface with the local people, the question that Jeff just raised, and as they met the leadership in these surrounding counties, they were meeting people who were already leaders in these communities, and they were members of the NAACP. So when they met E.W. Steptoe in Amen County, E.W. Steptoe was a landowner, NAACP president. So when they went to these various counties, they were meeting people that were part of the Medgar Evers NAACP network. So McComb becomes this challenge in one sense because they had the varying ideas, this confluence of people and organizations. And I would ask you, you know, if you were in McComb, 1961, you were invited by the local president of the NAACP, and he asked you to conduct a voter registration drive. And you came to town and said, okay, this is what we're going to do. And then you had some people in SNCC or in the organization said, well, we don't really want to do voter registration. That's really not our thing. We want to engage in direct action. What would you do in McComb? And you know that there's a segregated bus station, there's a segregated lunch counter, there's segregation in the churches, there's segregation and all this stuff, and you're a hot shot coming from Ohio or New York or some place, Nashville, Tennessee or Washington, D.C., and you know how to straighten up things in Mississippi, what would you do? What would you do?
Let that play itself out with some guidance. And so if you come in with the mantra that SNCC came with, that you
you're right. If you come in with your mantra, let the local people decide. But once you get in there and you decide that maybe you should follow some of the young people who said we should go and integrate the bus station.
And the local people might not agree.
Well, you know, I mean, the young people are you know, come on. In your teaching of the movement, the young people are up front and center, are they not? Absolutely. So, should the young people be front and center in McComb? So, should they not be? I mean, you shouldn't listen to the young people in McComb.
You have to.
Yes, talk to me.
I think it connects, I think the question you're asking connects with what Dr. Williams gave us. And that is, we've got to be thinking about not only kind of who's here right now, but what future we're trying to create. And so there's got to be some realities that we can lean on, where if we know that change needs to happen, and one group, if this happens to be a younger group, is saying, hey, we need some of these changes to happen in this particular way, we can take that image, as Mary said, and we can roll with that.
Yeah.
And that, you know, one of the ideas is that some other people don't come around and see that.
Okay. Yes, Rob?
Somewhere I read in here that in places like McComb, voter registration was direct action.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know, when things started changing, it seemed to me, and tell me if this is wrong or right, when there was violence against Bob Moses. I mean, he tried to register people to vote, and they got beaten up.
Right.
And then people said, we've got to do something else. We've got to react in some way. And that's when things sort of expanded.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah, and that's true. Things get to expand. But also, you know, you had these public facilities, right? And you had the bus terminal there, right? And you had the drugstore there, and you had churches in town. You know, you had these facilities that were segregated. In McComb, 1961, you know, as a student, you are aware of what has happened in Montgomery. You're aware of what has happened by then in Greensboro, right? Or Rock Hill, or Memphis, or Topeka, or Hoxie, Arkansas. And young people on the move. You're exactly right. I mean, Bob and those people were jailed, and they were in jail. In fact, the 115 students stopped in front of the city hall to begin praying one by one. Brenda first, and then Curtis, and then Hollis, and then Bobby Talbot, and then finally all of us herded up the steps and into the city courthouse. And Bob Zelman, who was the only white participant, attacked on the steps as he went up. And then a mob outside, waiting, milling around, threatening. And inside, they brought the people down, the white people, the so-called good citizens of the town, one by one, to take a look at this Moses guy. And they would come down and stand in front of the jail and say, "Where's Moses? Where's Moses?" So you're exactly right. I mean, Moses has been beaten. He was in the jail, and they were coming down to look at Moses, right? And the young people said, you know, we need to protest this. So you're right, that was part of the protest. But also, the other piece is that they had these segregated places there. And so that was an organized effort. This is from Howard Zinn, SNCC, The New Abolitionist, the first book that was written on SNCC. And Howard Zinn says, when I asked him this question when we were at Harvard, he says Moses described this scene to him. So he got this from Moses. But C.C. Bryant had said that we want a voter registration drive. So young people want to go and integrate the bus station or go down and have a hamburger at the drugstore, at the counter. And if you are a SNCC leader and you are there to roll with the local people and the young people start moving on those facilities, what do you do? As one of the leaders, what do you do? Get on board. You get on board, right? You get on board. Is that what you would do if you were in a leadership position there? Would you do like Jeff? You would get on board? Would you follow the young people? What would you do? Or would you remain neutral?
In a very real sense, you'd have to work the politics of it, because you can't, I mean, you've got different constituencies of local people, and you would have to navigate those waters. I don't know quite how you'd do it, but you couldn't not. I mean, you just have to navigate those waters. You've got NAACP leadership that wants voter education. You've got young people who are doing it anyway, you know. And so I don't know, but you'd have to navigate those waters, I suppose.
Okay, so in 1961, in McComb, you would say to yourself, hey guys, let's navigate these waters.
You would do it, yeah.
You try and stop them from doing it. You try and influence them to do something to follow what you want them to do. Non-direct action.
Yeah. But also now, you remember, you got a crew already there, because the SNCC staff is divided, right? So you got a crew who's saying, hot shots from Ohio or hot shots from Nashville saying, well, you know, these places are segregated, right? So what we ought to do, you know, we ought to move on. And there was clearly some conflict with the SNCC staffers. So how do you resolve that? Let's call a SNCC meeting, right? All of you are SNCC field secretaries. Let's call a meeting. And let's have a discussion about this. Folks, what we gonna do? Got young people who want to march on the bus station, want to march on X institution. What are we gonna do? Yes.
I think it was necessary to get all, get everybody on the same page. So yes, SNCC coming in and everyone else coming in would have to get on board and not only gain the support of the local people, and that may be one way to do it, and then prioritize. If the idea is let's go do voter registration, that's what we're going to do. But here are some other things. We need to desegregate these counters, whatever. Okay. So the goal, because this is the thing that I feel very strong. When you have a lot of disorganization going on, the real deal does not get accomplished. So the idea would be to try and make everything more cohesive. So however we do that, and if that's a meeting where we all yell and shout, whatever, that's good. But then let's come out of here with a priority list.
Yeah.
I don't think it would be an either-or proposition. I think as organizers, it's usually better to look at a proposition that's both and, so that we begin to talk about our strengths. What strength do I have as an organizer sitting at this table, and where can I best apply my strength? And what strength do our youth have, and where can they best apply their strength? And how can we coordinate in such a way that we know what's going on, so that there is no disruption among us in moving forward, as the students move forward to do the work that they're doing, and as the other group moves forward to do the voter registration. That we have to be in really deep relationship as organizers and as planners with each other, and be really clear about where we're going and why. But it's not either or. That's my main.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Bob?
It is important to get on board. You can't stop, you can't stand back, but complicating thing is what's going to happen with the parents and with the other local people, the other adult leaders, when they're troubled by the fact that the kids are going out and getting themselves arrested. So that puts SNCC in a bind because that's a local question that has to be resolved.
I think a group is sustainable only to the extent that it's continuing to be, or it's perceived to be serving the needs of the community. And so long as, regardless of the skills, we want to be able to tailor leadership skills and organizing skills in a way that are meeting those perceived needs. So if you have to diversify your organization so that you're meeting those people who want to be actively involved in voter registration, at the same time that you're meeting those people who think that educational or even social activities are important, you have to make it so that the organization itself is responding to what those perceived needs are in the community. And that's how you get people on board, is by making the organization seem, viable and the solution.
What happens is exactly what that was just that it divided itself into two wings. Yeah, you got NEH over direct action and Charles Jones over. And then you think about, you look back over the period and see that actually it makes more sense for direct action piece to play itself out as far as it could. Because how can you operate in a place of political participation when you have a society separated by race? So it seems that you have to desegregate public space before you can go into the whole and exercise the constitution of voting. And so that we kind of play out in that sequence. Okay. Yes.
And I think too, leadership is the key term. I remember reading somewhere that SNCC saw itself as a or non-hierarchical, right?
Yeah.
So that you're talking about
Well,
discussion as opposed to just
Yeah.
the leaders go in a room and talk and come
Yeah.
out and then give the orders, right? That
Yeah.
it is a community style and that everyone has a voice, right? And you're valuable. And then based on, I don't know if it's, I forgot the term I was about to say, but that it's not consensus, but that it was more democratic, right? That you did at least majority rule. And that's my understanding. So that leadership is imagined and sort of imagined very differently, practiced very different. So that it is sort of led by the majority as opposed to.
Well, I'm sorry, just a minute. But SNCC really operated on consensus.
Okay.
SNCC, yeah. So SNCC meetings would last forever.
Until you
Yeah,
got
right.
consensus.
Okay. So they had, yes.
Well, some of the realities that I'm tuning into is that the younger persons in McComb were dealing with their experiences, and the older generation were dealing with their experiences.
Yeah.
And the younger generation were ready for action, whereas the older generation had much of what had happened previously. They were very well aware. And I call those two different dichotomies. But at some point, the young ones were going to do what they needed to do. Now, the other point that I would make sociologically is that Mississippians, perhaps everywhere except in the civil rights movement, did not like outsiders. They are slow to adjust to outsiders. So that's why it would have been necessary for members of SNCC and others coming in from other parts of the world to get on board, to gain that consensus and to gain that relationship so that some action could happen and it could be effective.
Yeah. Well, yes, please, go ahead.
I think the consensus conversation is really interesting. I don't remember which one of the books it was in, but there was this one line talking about how the civil rights movement and the national narrative has often been taught to students from this top-down thing, that there were these great leaders and people who subscribe to this. And this conversation very much reemphasizes the idea of local people coming together, gathering consensus, and forming a movement that was more this way versus this way of how it's normally taught. And that's one thing that I very much appreciated from part of the reading, and that even the conversation that we've had about the importance of the individuals coming together to
Yes.
interject something?
Go ahead.
Not to.
Yeah, this is Joan Brown. Joan is gonna be on the panel at 2:30, and Joan was in Albany. She's a friend of the Haim Institute. Yeah.
These discussions in SNCC were not theoretical. And we did decide collectively what SNCC would do, but then each individual decided within that strategy what they would do or not do. Because once you said you would do something, there was nothing more sacred than keeping your word. And we had to look at the person on the left and right and say, if we do this, am I willing to die or to have this person die or this person? We knew it was deadly serious. And so while you say discussion, it wasn't like this discussion. It was serious stuff, and we had to take time to make sure that we were doing what we needed to do and were willing to die for.
And remember that C.C. Bryant was president of the chapter of the NAACP. And C.C. Bryant invited Bob Moses to come to McComb to conduct voter registration drive. So, yes, that was a direct action engagement, and that happened. But C.C. Bryant didn't know about Diane Nash and what SNCC had decided to do. C.C. Bryant knew what he wanted in McComb. So, when you think about this moment. C.C. Bryant invited to go registration drive in McComb, and you had SNCC essentially in the NAACP in McComb. Fast forward and think about Albany. Think about Albany. When Charles Sherrod and Cordell and the other SNCC people ended up in Albany, think about the coalition. Clearly, as a community, Albany was much better organized. Because not only did you have the NAACP in Albany, but you had other organizations as a part of the mix. But C.C. Bryant had a greater presence in McComb because he was just C.C. Bryant in the NAACP. So the direct action deal was important for the young people. But clearly C.C. Bryant did not share that opinion. So, you know, I'm thinking if you are teaching about McComb and you're teaching about the sort of the central event that started the direct protest movement in Mississippi, I mean, sort of the development of the above ground movement, how do you teach this? I mean, what do you do with C.C. Bryant? I mean, what do you do with the local people in McComb? Or do you concentrate on the SNCC hotshots and Bob Moses? I mean, what do you do? I mean, how do you explain that to the students? Yeah, Jeff?
I think you have to talk about all of it. You have to talk about Herbert Lee too when you do McComb and you do Southwest Mississippi.
Right.
And he's in the NAACP.
Yeah.
And that has a role in what happens in the McComb movement in terms of.
Yeah, you know, and Herbert Lee was doing what?
Trying to register to vote. Trying to get other rural.
That's right. He was not even direct action. That's right. Yeah, I mean, hadn't dawned on him, right? Yeah. But you know, the idea is that, yeah, you need to tell it all, but in terms of the narrative, how do you uplift the people who, you know, were there? I mean, how do you get at some of the untold stories? And that's, yes.
I would start not with the people, but with the idea of building relationships. So in the Hogan chapter on page 60, there's a description about Bob Moses building relationships based on individual meetings. So I ask students on the very first day of class to do one-on-ones.
Yeah.
And it starts with a random process. They hear each other, they come up with their own questions. I give a few examples, but they have to write something in class brief. What did you learn about this person and what matters to her? And they start to understand that there are connections that they can't see. And then the next day, they do a different one-on-one and write that up. So eventually, many people in the room can answer the question of, what does this person I'm sitting next to care deeply about? And what difference will that make to our whole group? So I don't necessarily start with all the details, but with the process of building relationships.
Well, you know, obviously these relationships are profoundly important because in some, I mean, let's go back to what Professor Williams said in terms of what Medgar Evers had done with the NAACP in developing those chapters, obviously developing leadership, I mean, in all these different places. I mean, Winston Hudson and Dovey Hudson, all these people who were a part of this network, who became, obviously, a part of the leadership network as SNCC and COFO move forward. So, you know, you're exactly right. But then you have to have, obviously, Bob Moses, as Moses, the person, the man, developed relationships with C.C. Bryant and all this, because when they were de-invited out of McComb, you know, they left, right? And they moved to the next project, which was Hattiesburg. And then Bob Moses, that's how I met Bob Moses. When he put him out of McComb, he came to Holland Springs. But he clearly, on one level, had developed this personal relationship with C.C. Bryant, because years later, when Bob returned, you know, C.C. Bryant welcomed him as a long-lost son. You know, so you're right about the relationship. But at the time, they were in McComb, and they were on the ground, and you had these new field secretaries. I mean, this was SNCC's first sort of full-time organizing effort. These people were professional organizers, and they were mobilizing people. And they had this confrontation in a very real sense with the ideology of what SNCC was talking about, at least an arm of SNCC, and what the local community wanted. And but obviously you have to tell the whole story, but I just think it's important to uplift and lift up the local people in McComb who had some sense of what they wanted and were willing to obviously fight for it. Because after the SNCC people left McComb, who did they leave in McComb? Right? They left C.C. Bryant, they left the local people in McComb. I mean, they were there. And when you leave and come back years later, the local people are still there. And so, I just think about what Professor Williams said. Think about what Medgar Evers was doing before there was McComb, right? Think about what the local people were doing in Clarksdale before COFO, right? Think about that in the context of sort of examining and thinking about the civil rights movement in Mississippi. It was not if nothing was going on in Albany or McComb before the coming of SNCC. You know, so it is important, I think, as we talk to our students, to try to get that across to them too. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Bob Moses and Nancy Moore? Because it's described, I've seen it described as a father-son relationship.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, I was talking to Joan as I picked it up this morning, and I commented to Joan, you know, Ella Baker provided sort of the impetus for Bob to come to Mississippi and do this tour and examine places and all this stuff. You you read about that. But clearly, when Bob Moses met Amzie Moore, it was the second coming of his father. Because Amzie Moore was the father figure. When you hear Bob speak even today publicly, Amzie Moore always is a part of the narrative. He'll mention E.W. Steptoe, he'll mention C.C. Bryant, he won't mention Aaron Henry that much, but he mentioned, and he, and so Amzie Moore was very important to him. I remember when Amzie Moore died, and they had his funeral in Cleveland. Bob Moses was essentially the principal speaker. And, it was a funeral, but it was just a praise that Bob Moses gave Amzie Moore. He had the utmost respect for Amzie Moore. So what you've read, and if you hear him, you get, if there's any passion publicly that he expresses, when he talks about Amzie Moore, you can feel the passion, how he related, to Amzie. And Amzie clearly was an outstanding guy. He was a great man. He was an entrepreneur, civil rights leader. He stood the test of time, one of these World War II veterans. He got his start in the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, so that was that connection. But he really identified and respected the words of Amzie, because Amzie at one point described this idea of this light that we all have. And Bob Moses uses that a whole lot. That's Amzie Moore, But, yeah. So, but now, the voter registration project was not in Bolivar County. It was in McComb. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Quick
Yes, ma'am.
question.
Go ahead.
And this is for clarification in my notes. So when teaching about SNCC in McComb, 1961, shift the focus to what was happening in the community before SNCC arrived. Talk about what's happening with the locals.
Yeah. I mean, this is what Reverend Williams' sermon was about. Yeah.
Hey, that was a serious point.
That's right.
Went around
Absolutely.
each
Yeah.
one of us. Okay.
But because I think you have to push back. I mean, clearly moving forward, Bob Moses is a theoretician, right? Because 1962, we talked about somebody. Yeah. She's gone. No, she's here. She talked about James Meredith, 1962. But think, and Tommy yesterday, what was the big event in 62, Tommy, that you identified? Meredith Ole Miss. But think about 62, friends. When you think about the Mississippi Civil Rights narrative, think about 62. Fannie Lou Hamer was evicted from the W.D. Marlowe plantation in 1962. So when I think about the civil rights movement in Mississippi, I don't think about James Meredith. I think about Fannie Lou Hamer. I think about W. Hudson. I think about Winston. I think about E.W. Steptoe. I don't think about James Meredith. 1962, Fannie Lou Hamer was evicted from the W.D. Marlowe plantation. And can you imagine Mississippi without Fannie Lou Hamer? Can you imagine this country without Fannie Lou Hamer? It's like imagining this country without Ray Charles. Come on. No way. But 1962, Reverend Merrill Winston Lindsay and Reverend Robert L.T. Smith ran for the U.S. Congress, the first black people to run for Congress in Mississippi since Reconstruction. 1962. This is a part of the Mississippi narrative. This is a part of the Mississippi story that local people, 2 ministers running for the U.S. Congress. And this was a Bob Moses idea, too. Bob Moses was Reverend Smith's campaign manager. Aaron Henry was Reverend Lindsay's campaign manager. This is 1962. It pushes this narrative forward. So you go to 63, you go to the Freedom Vote, this germinates in McComb. But you cannot talk about this narrative without looking at the people that energized the movement and brought life to it. They implemented what was going down, especially in the head of Bob Moses. Yeah, Jim?
So Wesley Hogan has an agenda to write a book about SNCC.
Yeah.
And so the chapter on McComb is because what her project is, C.C. Bryant doesn't loom large. And I hadn't thought about that even when I was reading. I appreciate what you're saying. But one way to do what you're suggesting about shifting the focus back to the local people is to say Bob Moses was invited. How did that happen? How did that happen?
That's right.
Charles Sherrod was invited into Albany.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean, and that's why SNCC went to places where they were invited, where there was leadership that already existed, and I think we can tell it that way.
Yeah, and he says that.
Right.
Yeah, but now, yeah, and that's important, you know, and you can, you have your spin on it, but clearly the spin should not be that the story is all about this guy or these guys instead of the people who were there when they came and when they left. That's all I'm saying. And I just think it's important to tell a story like that. Okay, and it's 12 o'clock, and I'm through.
Thank you.